Bard's Tale. Last I left you with a collection of Tibetan folktales. Now we move to the east to hear the folklore of China. With a culture that dates back over 4,000 years, it is no surprise that the Chinese people have a long and vibrant plethora of folklore and tales. From ancient dragons to wise spirits, and to silver-eating ants, the Chinese have a rich folklore. And that's where we will begin, with a tale of a man who lost his silver to ants. In ancient China there lived a man in Nan named Ho Quan. He was kind-hearted, and he would never kill a living thing. In his home he had a jar filled with 1,000 silver pieces, which was kept in a casket. One day an army of white ants, of which there were many in Nan, crept into the casket and ate part of the silver within, then returned to their cave. When his family discovered the theft, they traced the ants back to their home. There were millions of them. The family believed that if they were to put all these ants into a crucible, they may be able to burn away the ants and rescue some of the stolen silver. But Ho Quan objected. The death of so many creatures on account of such a small sum of silver was not right. He could not bear to see it. The family dropped the matter and returned home. That night, Ho Quan had a vivid dream. He was visited by scores of white-armored soldiers who beckoned him into a carriage, where he would then be carted off to the palace of their king. Ho Quan agreed and was taken away to a prosperous-looking town, filled with magnificent buildings. Most magnificent of all was the palace, and he was led towards it by several officers who came to meet him. He stood before the king, clad in a royal fashion, who descended from the throne and cordially saluted Ho Quan. "By your benevolent acts we have been saved from our enemy. While not forgetting your kindness, the lack of strict discipline among my people caused you some trouble recently. How could I let your kindness go unrequited this time? There is a certain tree near your residence, readily identified, under which in olden times buried a jar full of silver. Just dig that out and keep it for yourself. You are the unicorn of mankind that will never hurt any living soul. It is a pity that you are now too old to enjoy the fruits of your kindness yourself, but your descendants will reap what you have sown." Ho Quan was escorted back to his home, where he suddenly awoke. He meditated for a time on what he had dreamt, and believed that the entire dream had been a message from the ants he had saved. So, taking the word of the Ant King in his dream as truth, he went to the tree and dug. And as the king had said, Ho Quan found a jar buried many years ago, filled to the brim with silver. The king had been right, and Ho Quan's son would go on to become an eminent scholar. This tale is of 3 cruel hunters, given, but not taking, a second chance. In the country of Hsiang Tan, in Hu Kuang, lived an old and much respected gentleman. Despite this, his 3 sons were of quite ill repute. They did not care for culture or refinement, but instead took pleasure in the simple passions of their sports, and roaming through the mountains. While on a hunt with a large company of young people, they unexpectedly came across an old man dressed in pure white garments who knelt before them. To refrain from injuring all growing things, and from killing whatever is awakening into life, is the part of universal loving kindness as observed by saints and sages, he said. It is now springtime where everything in nature is starting to life again. If you pay no attention to the tenderness of heart as practiced by holy men, and by unchecking the wild passions lurking in men's hearts, if you set the woods afire and exterminate the animals and insects that inhabit them, you will surely incur heavenly displeasure, and suffer the consequences thereof. I, poor old creature, have 7 young children in my family, and there is not time to remove them to a place of safety. But if you, gentlemen, have pity on us, we will never forget your mercy, and will reward you later." The 3 men thought on this, but did not exactly understand what the old man was asking of them. But they agreed to do as he asked without much further thought. The old man left, and the party were left to wonder who he could have been and when he might have come to this wilderness. They argued that his appeal to their sympathy did not seem very human. They thought he might have been the spirit of some old animal which lived in the high mountains. Considering this, they pursued him, tracking him till they saw the old man enter a cave. They spread a net across the entrance and set it alight. The net burned and the flames roared. Suddenly a white stag tore through the net, bursting from the cave entrance. It ran through the besiegers, leapt atop a standing rock, and took the form of the old man. "You have killed my 7 young daughters. You shall have to pay a penalty for this heartless act. A calamity 10 times greater than I have suffered will befall your family." The 3 young men shot at him with their bows, but the old man caught the arrows in his hands, breaking them into pieces which disappeared. The hunters returned home with nothing to show for their efforts. A time later, a Taoist monk came to their home, and predicted for them an imperial career and great prosperity in the future. Incited by the monk's prophecy, the 3 men began a rebellion, calling on the aid of their many friends, with plans to overthrow the reigning dynasty to establish their own leadership. While preparations for the rebellion began, somebody reported their activities to the authorities. Soldiers immediately marched on their home and arrested every member of the family. After a brief investigation, they were found guilty of treason. 70 members of their families and associates were executed. Nobody ever discovered what became of the Taoist monk who began this scheme, or of the man who reported the 3 men to the authorities. The final tale is of 3 daughters and their husbands in a drinking competition. Once a family of 3 daughters married 3 men. The eldest daughter married a physician, the second wed a magistrate, and the third, seemingly the most intelligent and clever, married a simple farmer. The parents of the daughters wished to celebrate a birthday, and so called their 3 daughters and their husbands to join them. So the 3 daughters came with their husbands to wish them a long, prosperous, and happy life. The parents prepared a meal for their daughters' husbands and presented them with plenty of wine. While drinking, the oldest son-in-law proposed a game, with the intent of embarrassing the youngest, who he knew had never attended school. The game was simple. Each one must invent a verse which rhymes and makes sense, and must be based in the sky, on the earth, at the table, and in the room. But whosoever should fail this challenge must empty 3 glasses as punishment. Everyone there accepted, but the third son-in-law, knowing he was outmatched, felt embarrassed and insisted on leaving. The guests would not let him go and obliged him to keep his seat. Then the oldest son began. "In the sky the phoenix proudly flies. On the earth the lambkin tamely lies. At the table, through an ancient book I wade. In the room I softly call the maid." The second followed. "In the sky the turtle dove flies round. On the earth the ox paws up the ground. At the table one studies the deeds of yore. In the room the maid sweeps the floor." Finally the third, but he stumbled, unsure what to say. The guests urged him till he broke out in rough tones of voice. "In the sky flies a leaden bullet. On the earth stalks a tiger beast. On the table lies a pair of scissors. In the room I call the stable boy." The other 2 sons-in-law clapped their hands and howled with laughter. "Why, the 4 lines do not rhyme at all. And besides, they do not make sense. A leaden bullet is no bird. The stable boy does his work outside. Would you call him into the room? Nonsense, nonsense. Drink." But before they stopped speaking, and before the third could take his drinks, the third daughter raised the curtain to the women's room and stepped out. She was clearly angry, yet could not seem to suppress a slight smile. "How so do our lines not make sense? Listen a moment and I will explain them to you. In the sky our leaden bullet will shoot your phoenix and your turtle dove. On the earth our tiger beast will devour your sheep and your ox. On the table our pair of scissors will cut up all your old books. And finally, in the room, well, the stable boy can marry your maid." the oldest son-in-law conceded. She had scolded him well, and if she were a man, she'd have had her degree long ago. As punishment, they would all empty their 3 glasses.